Hello, everybody. Welcome to our latest webinar. We're very delighted to have Moshe Machover with us today, an expert on the Middle East, founder of Matzpen, Israeli socialist and Marxist. And he will be addressing the very important question of Israel's annexation plans and the so-called two-state solution, which we've actually put in as a two-state proposal because it's not much of a solution. Moshe will be speaking for about 30 minutes, then we can open up for question and comments from the floor. If you want to speak, please, under participants, if you click participants at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a blue hand doing this. Looks like a blue hand holding up. Please click this, and then I can see on the right-hand side, I can see who's, Pamela's already tried it out. That's how it works, exactly right. And then I can see who wants to speak and take you later in the discussion.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I can't see all of the participants, but
no, it's a webinar, so they're all on the side, so they can see you, but
they can see
people.
Well, yes, thank you for inviting me. I got a very nice invitation to speak from the comrade who is education officer of
Matthew, yes, Matthew.
That's Matthew Jones.
Yes.
And he says, well, this is going to be the topic. He asked me to introduce a webinar on Palestine in light of the current moves to annex parts of the West Bank by the current Israeli government. Comrades also wanted to cover the two-state proposal as put together in the Oslo Accords and why this is not a viable alternative to, etc., to the current situation or current occupation and the exclusion of Palestinians. And this invitation made me gasp in surprise. Can anyone guess up? We've got a chat issue and a chat option. And so if anyone has a suggestion as to why I gasped and my eyes bulged to receive this invitation and the text of the invitation, maybe I'll wait half a minute if someone wants to type a reply to a guess why this invitation made me gasp. No? I don't see anything.
Settlements.
Because it takes a huge courage. No, it doesn't take any courage. I'm sitting here. Please tell us why. Okay, I'll let you know. Well, it says the two-state proposal as put together in the Oslo Accords. Let me tell you something. The Oslo Accords says nothing about two states. Nothing at all. There's no mention. But you see, this comrade who is an education officer of the LLA and is himself politically educated, is under the illusion that the Oslo Accords said something about two states. It never did. There is no mention of a Palestinian state there. But nevertheless, people believe that it is. So there is something, as it were, supernatural in this. Somehow, we, by smoke and mirrors, people are, and I'm sure the comrade is not alone in believing that the Oslo Accords were about two states. They were not, but people are made to believe it. And this is actually a sort of illustration of the whole way people think about the conflict in the Middle East. You are made to believe something that is totally untrue. I mean, there is no such thing. It never existed. I mean, in fact, I put it to you two things. First of all, the two-state, even in the way that it has been imagined by the best people, I'm talking about people like Corbyn, Norman Finkelstein, Chomsky, people who are certainly excuse me for one moment.
Sorry, comrades.
Sorry.
No worries.
Well, even at its best, the way it is imagined by people who are supporting of Palestinian rights, it is not going to be any kind of a solution, because look at the disparity between even the best that the Palestinian state could have expected, which is 22% of Palestine as it was under the British mandate, with a population, if we count only Palestinians that are actually in Israel-Palestine, about equal to the number of Israeli Jews, so-called Israeli Jews, they are Hebrew-speaking nation. So it would be, and this would exclude, you know, some of the most important parts of the country. I mean, this would be, even at its best, a kind of travesty. But even that is never on the cards. Okay, comrades haven't read the Oslo Accords. Okay, they probably haven't heard or haven't read a short article, actually a set of theses that a comrade of mine, Emmanuel Farjun, and I wrote many years ago in 1976. And there we explained why Israel is never going to allow a Palestinian state. We quoted Dayan. If I can find the text very quickly, I'll read it out to you. What Dayan said in 1976. No, he said it in 1975, and we quoted him in a year later. Okay, he said, fundamentally a Palestinian state is the antithesis of the state of Israel. The basic and naked truth is that there is no fundamental difference between the relation of the Arabs of Nablus to Nablus, and that is in the West Bank, and that of the Arabs of Jaffa to Jaffa. And if today we set out on this road and say that the Palestinians are entitled to their own state because they are natives of the same country and have the same rights, then it will not end with the West Bank. The West Bank, together with Gaza Strip, do not amount to a state. The establishment of such a state would lay a cornerstone to something else, either the state of Israel or a Palestinian state. That's what Dayan said in 1975. By the way, I'm only quoting things that have been said and documented after the June War of '67, when Israel actually conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. If you look at statements by leading Zionists such as Ben-Gurion before the '67 war and even before '48, you will see that the strategy of the mainstream Zionist movement was always to colonize the whole of Palestine, at least the whole of Palestine west of the Jordan River. And they were prepared to accept an interim situation where they don't control. They were going by stages, you know. The strategy was a strategy of step by step, not they did not expect to get the whole thing all at once. And anyway, that was Dayan in 1975. Now, mentioning the Oslo Agreement, when Rabin, the sainted signer of the Oslo Accords, when he presented this Oslo Accords to the Knesset for ratification, and that was a few days before he was assassinated, he also made the statement about that. He said, and that is his last speech in the Knesset, on the 5th of October 1995. He was assassinated a few days later when he was making a public speech in the square in Tel Aviv. But here is what is told the Knesset. We view the permanent solution in the framework of the State of Israel, which will include most of the area of the land of Israel, as it was under the rule of the British Mandate, in other words, most of Palestine, and alongside it, the Palestinian entity, which will be a home to most of the Palestinian residents living in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. We would like this entity to be an entity which is less than a state, and which will independently run the lives of the Palestinians under its authority, etc., etc. The borders will not be the borders of as they existed before the June War of '67. So, okay, so people may not have read the Oslo Accords, but they certainly should be aware of how the Israeli government, the person who actually signed the Accords on behalf of Israel, how he viewed no Palestinian state. So it's not a two-state solution. It is an Israeli state with some autonomous Bantustans run by the Palestinians themselves, where they can collect their own rubbish and deliver their own post and clean their own streets. That's what, and for this purpose, the Oslo Accords actually set up a Palestinian Authority, which is a sort of misnomer, because it has no authority except what is bestowed on it by Israel. Okay, so this was it. Okay, Dayan and Rabin both belonged originally to labor Zionism, which was the major force in Israel until certainly after the June War of '67. Now it has disappeared. The forecast is that the Israeli Labor Party, if the election now, will not even get one seat in the Knesset. And that is under the Israeli system, which is proportional. So you don't need really too many votes nationwide to get a single seat, but they will not even pass the threshold for getting a seat. So it's disappeared. What about the present government? Well, Netanyahu is also on record as saying the following. I will read a quote from what Netanyahu is. He made a speech actually all about the okay, here it is. Oh, sorry. I will have to look for him, Netanyahu. Yes, he made a speech. Let me get the exact. Here we are. Yes, it comes from the Times of Israel, an English language paper, and the article is dated 13 July 2014. That's a few days before the great Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip. Netanyahu finally speaks his mind. He made a speech in Hebrew only, significantly. And he made it absolutely clear, as the paper report, that there's not going to be a Palestinian state. He's not going to allow it. So what is all this palaver about a two-state solution and a so-called Palestinian state, or even statelet? It's a deception. It's an illusion. There is no two-state solution. There is a two-state illusion. And the way it's being used, Israel has been manipulating it from the very beginning, when the whole thing, two-state solution, so-called, arose. There is no Israeli commitment ever, official commitment for a two-state solution. There is a commitment to negotiate. There used to be something which is now dead, but it used to be called the peace process. You remember? I mean, do comrades remember the something called the peace process? It's been dead, and it died actually quite a few years ago. I'll return to it. The thing was that the process, the so-called peace process, was a process of supposed negotiation. Israel was prepared to negotiate with the Palestinians, with Palestinian colonized people, the modalities of a two-state. Well, let's talk, let's discuss it. Well, it's been compared to two people discussing how to share a pizza, while one of them is actually biting one piece after the other from the pizza, and they continue to negotiate. This is what was happening. It gave Israel a way to buy time. You negotiate. Each time Israel was making harsher and harsher conditions. Sometimes the Palestinians would accept this condition, and then Israel would up the ante. Sometimes the Palestinians would reject it, and then they were the rejectionists, and so on. This was going on for years and years and years, and people were fascinated by this peace process that is supposed to lead to a two-state solution. But Israel has never had the intention of reaching such a resolution. It was just a process which gave Israel time to colonize more and more of the West Bank. Gaza Strip was not really thought very suitable for colonization. It is too densely populated. It is a huge, really a huge concentration camp controlled by Israel and besieged by it. There were some small Israeli colonies there, but they were withdrawn by Sharon in 2006. The object of colonization has always been mainly the West Bank, and of course the people don't remember anymore the Golan Heights, which Israel stole from Syria, or conquered from Syria and started colonizing, but it took care to ethnically cleanse it. And this is the usual tactic of Israeli colonization. Israeli colonization, and I'll return to this, is colonization of land, but preferably with as few Palestinian people on it as possible. Israel is not interested in Palestinian people, even as a labor force, as a workforce. They are surplus to requirement. So this is Dayan in 75, Rabin in 1995, and Netanyahu in 2014, all of them saying, no, this is not going to be, when they talk seriously, and not making sort of make believe to the so-called international community. They say there is not going to be a thing. So the long-term strategy of the Zionist movement, the mainstream, is stepwise expansion, but taking care, if possible, to ethnically cleanse whatever is being annexed step by step, making use of historical opportunity to extend the expansion. And in the meantime, all sorts of smoke and mirror, make-believe, roadmaps leading nowhere, peace process without product, and blaming the Palestinians always for being difficult customers. We have no one to deal with, the saying goes. Well, look, I've explained all this in greater detail and with some analysis in an article which I recommend people read. And this article was written not fortuitously in 2014. Actually, it's in the Weekly Worker of the 18th of September 2014. And it is called the Zionist Quest for Legitimacy. I explain all these things and make further analysis in that article. I don't want to repeat the whole of it. I think, with all modesty, you may not have read the Oslo Accords, you may not have read Rabin's speech, but read my article. I think it can be a good introduction to people who are simply misled by the mainstream media into thinking all sorts of things which are absolutely fake and don't exist. The peace process, actually, I wrote this article, that article that I just referred to in 2014, after the peace process actually collapsed. And it collapsed when towards the end of the Obama presidency, John Kerry is remembered for saying, you know, the whole thing went poof. Israel actually took steps to junk, to torpedo the peace process. And in fact, it has never been, the so-called peace process has never been resumed. I wrote the article because I thought Israel in junking the peace process was taking a dangerous step, because so long as the peace process, so-called, was taking place, people were still willing to believe that there is such a thing at the end of the process called the two-state solution. If the peace process is terminated, if it goes poof, as John Kerry was Obama's foreign secretary, if you don't remember. He said, you know, that's gone. So what will people cling to if not the peace process? It will be very difficult for Israel to maintain the illusion, this hypocrisy. Well, it didn't actually. I mean, people continue to talk about the peace, the two-state solution as if it really existed, and nevertheless, you know, although there is no visible process leading to it, even on paper, even a simulated one. So that was 2014. Why do so many people believe that there is such a thing such a possibility as a two-state solution or a two-state proposal? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. Right? There's a variety. People believe or profess to believe in it for all sorts of reasons. Some people profess to believe in it because they are Israeli advocates. They advocate for Israel, and they would like to sustain the illusion of a two-state in order to give Israel more time to continue this colonization. Some people are naive. They believe in it because they think, this is the only possible, the only realistic, and it could just happen maybe with a little pressure from the so-called international community. And some people go on referring to a two-state solution because they can't think of anything alternative to it. And any alternative to a two-state solution would either be, and I'm talking now about decent people, so a failure of two-state would either mean that the Palestinians would forever remain victims of Israeli colonization, or some other solution that will not be a two-state solution, but any alternative to a benign alternative, a benign in terms of being equitable and giving rights to the Palestinian national entity equal to the Hebrew nation, the Israeli, so-called Israeli Jewish nation. Anything like that would, in the current situation, mean overthrow of the Zionist regime. It will be the end of the state of Israel as a Jewish state. And people are shy of this alternative. They don't want to face it. They don't want to advocate the overthrow of the Zionist regime. And by the way, I also don't see any real prospects for overthrowing the Israeli regime in the near or the intermediate future. So people are stuck, and since they think that they should propose some kind of solution, then they stick to the old, tired two-state formula, which is now before our eyes vanishing. Now, again, this move, let me get to the immediate present. There was talk of Israeli annexation. Netanyahu promised to start this process on the 1st of July. He missed this date for various reasons, mostly because his boss, Trump, who was supposed to actually give his blessing to this annexation, was busy with other things and maybe was not so keen on it. The advisors of Trump are divided themselves. Some of them would like to see this plan of annexation go right ahead right now, and some, including Kushner, his son-in-law, would like things to slow down a bit. But there is no doubt that the plan of the existing Israeli regime is to annex further bits of Palestine, including majority or all of the Israeli illegal colonies, settlements in the West Bank, and eventually strip along the Jordan River. This has a virtue from an Israeli point of view, that it contains a lot of, especially the strip along the Jordan, contains a lot of very good land, but relatively few Palestinian people, something like altogether 100,000. There are a lot of Palestinians living just outside the area in which Israel is planning to annex, but whose lands are in it. You see, so for example, the whole city of Jericho is not part of the area that Israel is planning to annex, but people living in Jericho own land just outside, which is in the area to be annexed. Similarly, on on the rest of the periphery of that territory. So it has a virtue that it doesn't entail Israel taking in so many Palestinians. Even those are not going to get Israeli citizenship. Netanyahu made it clear. But their land will be ripe for annexation. Israel has got a whole tranche of legal mechanisms which were elaborated in the 1950s to rob the land of Palestinians who remained in Israel after the war of 1948. This could not be applied so far in the West Bank, but if these areas are to be annexed, then Israeli law would immediately apply and would enable large-scale robbery of Palestinian land to be given to Israeli settlers. This is only one of the consequences for the Palestinians for the Palestinian people of this prospective annexation. In fact, it will surround the major Palestinian population centers by Israeli territory. So far, the West Bank is contiguous with the Jordan River, and across it, and across the river there is the Kingdom of Jordan. Sorry.
Moshe, Daniel said to stop the computer. Stop the Zoom, stop the computer.
Okay, so so this is going to cause a lot of hardship, because the whole of the population centers, the densely populated areas of the West Bank will be totally surrounded by official Israeli territory. So this is again, something that is going to expose the Israeli state to the public opinion, which is, is going to supposedly to realize that the two-state solution is dead. Are they going to do anything about it? Well, if to judge by not only our government, Boris Johnson said, yeah, he's against it. Of course, he made a lot of noise about not agreeing with this annexation. He's opposed to it, but is he going to do anything about it? No. But not only Johnson, also Sir Keir, the leader of the Labour Party, who is caricatured in The Guardian as Kiev, also made a similar statement. He's against it. He denounces Israeli intention to annex, but are you going to take any steps, any sanctions against Israel? Well, no, he didn't commit himself to any such thing. Finally, I just want to make an important remark, final remark, as to how the situation in the Israel-Palestine should be regarded. Many people make a comparison between Israeli colonization and apartheid under South Africa. Now, of course, what Israel is implementing at present is apartheid according to the legal definition. That is undoubted. I mean, according to the official definition as defined by the World Court of Justice and the United Nations, what takes place in Israel-Palestine is apartheid. But it is not the same as in South Africa. In fact, it is more apart than apartheid. In the sense that under the South African apartheid, the colonizers, the small class really, or quasi-class of settlers, needed the indigenous population as labor power. They used it. The South African economy depended on the labor force of Black Africans, the majority. They couldn't get rid of them. In the case of Zionist colonization, the situation is very different. The Zionist dream is really of one state, but a Zionist state, an Israeli state encompassing the whole of Mandate Palestine and bits more, parts of Syria as well. But not along the Rainbow Nation model of South Africa, God forbid. No, the Zionist colonization has an option always in store, which the South African colonizers did not have, and that is trying to get rid of the indigenous population. In other words, what is called in Zionist parlance transfer. So one state, in the way it is not dreamed on by well-wishing people, but dreamed on or by the mainstream Zionism, entails also major ethnic cleansing. And this is what we should focus on to try as much as possible to create world public opinion to prevent that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moshe. As always, thought-provoking. I enjoyed that very much. Also the discussion why it isn't an apartheid regime. A lot of people on the left got in trouble as well with that, of course, and that's sort of also I wanted to touch on that on the issue, why are people shy to talk about, you know, that it's necessary to overthrow the Zionist state, is of course you get accused of being an anti-Semite. As somebody involved in labor against the witch hunt, we see plenty of those pieces of evidence being sent to us in their charge sheet of people being accused of being anti-Semites because they do want to do away with the Zionist, you know, Israel as a Zionist state just for Jews, which is of course based on discrimination of the Palestinians. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to read one out, and then there's two people in the audience who'd want to speak. Henry's asking, there was a large demonstration in Tel Aviv last week of middle-class Israelis protesting the government's economic policies regards COVID. Hadash Jabbar participated with an incoherent political message. In your opinion, should socialists participate in such demonstrations? And if so, with what political message? I'm going to bring in a couple of people now to also ask questions. Edward and Chet, could you switch on your cameras, please, so that you can ask a question. There you go. Hello, hello, Edward. Hello. I think you're still muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Right.
There you are. Well done. Yes, that's it.
Right. It has been, you know, an extremely interesting chat, and you know what Moshe was saying about, you know, this two-state solution thing being all a little bit of a snow job to confuse the issue and delay until, you know, the Israeli state can, in fact, absorb every other bit of the occupied territories. To me, I can only really see two solutions here, and these are the only solutions I can see. The first solution, which I believe is probably going to be really impossible, is for the Israeli Jews to withdraw to all the lands that they occupied before the 1967 war. That is one solution. the second one, which could possibly be possible, although I doubt this very much indeed, is that every Palestinian who has lost land by the gross apartheid and racialist actions of the Israeli Jews should be compensated for it in today's value money. I can't see any other solution apart from those two, but because obviously two-state, which I've thought for years, is a non-run. That is never going to happen. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy unfolding before our eyes, and it's going on and on. And the thing is, we aren't really involved in it, but other people are suffering so much. I'm a grandfather. I've got children. I've got grandkids. So have Palestinians, and they're watching their families die. And that's all I've got to say about that, really.
Thanks, comrade. Chet, please.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
So, Moshe, thank you very much for the talk. I've got a question to challenge your longest term perspective, I believe. Considering that we seem to find that right-wing attitudes, savagery and dishonesty are now very prevalent worldwide. Is the level of injustice that we're seeing now in Palestine just a continuation of thousands of years of injustice which hasn't always been presented as how the world is? And will it continue for thousands of years despite our best efforts? Because I think we're all at a stage when we can see the fight's necessary, the fight's got to continue. We just can't see a just and decent outcome which can come about in any short period of time. So what's the longest term perspective that you have on this? Will it somehow fix itself?
Thank you, Chad. Steve Freeman, please.
Hi, Moshe. Nice to see you again. See you looking well. I enjoyed your talk, as always, I always do. I've got a kind of question for you, I think. I agree with a lot of what you say, but I want to ask something which is maybe on the cusp of it. I agree that, well, first of all, I think Israel is here to stay. I think it's established itself now as a state. Maybe there was a time when it was maybe up to 1967 when maybe its permanence wasn't clear. I agree there's no such thing as a two-state solution. I think the key word there is solution. I agree that a Zionist Israel opposes a two-state solution and that they are playing the game as you previously described. But we still have to support the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories and the right of the Palestinians in the occupied territories to have full state power over that territory, full power to be able to have the control their borders and all those other things. Now, I wouldn't call that a two-state solution. It's not a solution to the problem, but I think it's something we should still, in effect, there'd be two states, by the way, if that happened. But I think that's still a correct democratic demand that the Palestinian people in the occupied territories can have the right to form their own state without the, we should continue to support that. That's a problem, of course, because Zionist Israel is not going to allow it. But we don't define ourselves by what they will allow. But do you think there is any possibility that Israel could be liberated from Zionism? In other words, Israel exists, but it's possible that Israel could become a democratic rather than a Zionist state. So that's what I'm kind of asking. That would mean a secular state, not a Jewish state, which obviously would be, and one committed to Zionism. Is that possible, or do you think that's an impossibility? So that's my question. Because I think that would be, just to finish this point, I think it'd be necessary for Israel to become a democratic state, for Palestine to get, the Palestinians to get their rights in the occupied territories.
Can I apologize? I had to switch off my computer for technical reasons, and I'm now on a different, on a laptop.
Steve, can you just repeat your point again, then, please?
I heard the last bit of the question.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll briefly say that I agree with a lot of the propositions. It's nice to see you again, by the way, and see you looking well. I agree with the propositions that you made in your talk, which was that there's no such thing as a two-state solution, that Zionist Israel is opposed to a two-state solution, that it's not a solution anyway. But I'm saying, first of all, we should continue to support the withdrawal of Israel from the occupied territories and the right of the Palestinian people to have their own state in those territories, which is what they are asking for, and their fully recognized state rights of any other state, equal to any other state. However, I wouldn't call that a solution, by the way. It's not a solution because it wouldn't solve that problem, by the way. But it would certainly be a victory for the Palestinians. So I don't think that's possible unless Israel became not a Zionist state, but a democratic state. I know it claims to be democratic, but I don't believe that it is. So is it possible, and this is my question, is it possible that Israel could, by forces inside Israel, the majority of people inside Israel, become actually a democratic state rather than a Zionist state, i.e. one not based on one religion, a secular state?
Can I reply to this?
Sure. You've missed one question. Can I just read? Okay, reply to this one and I'll read out the other one that you've missed earlier.
I think this is an extraordinarily important question. It is pointing at the heart of the matter. And I think Steve made a very perceptive distinction between demands and solutions. The two-state palaver is not a solution, and it's not going to happen anyway. But raising a demand for the end of Israeli occupation and for the right of the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination on whatever part Israel vacates, this is a demand. It is not going to happen for the same reason that a two-state solution is not going to happen, because if this demand were implemented, then there would be two states. This would be a two-state situation. If Israel withdraws from the occupied territories and the Palestinians exercise self-determination, then there would be a Palestinian state. Israel is not going to allow it, as we agreed. But what is the sense of making the demand? The sense of making the demand is to expose and to put the situation in public opinion on a moral basis. Look, I mean, this is our demand. It is equivalent to saying what is wrong with the present situation is that Israel is occupying the Palestinian people and is colonizing their land and so on. This should stop. But is it realistically going to happen anytime soon? No. I mean, Steve and I agree on this, and I explained that Israel is not going to allow it. But equally, Israel is not, and given the present moment, the present situation as it exists in Israel and in the surrounding region and in the whole world, there is no visible force that is going to force Israel to accept this equitable home for two peoples. Of course, it will have to recognize not only the equality of individual rights, but equality of national rights. There are two national collectives. The Hebrew nation, as distinct from the mythical worldwide Jewish nation, and the Palestinian Arab nation, which is part of the larger Arab nation regionally. So it would have, but the Israeli masses are not going to accept it because they have no incentive to accept it. is any force, political or military, from outside Israel that is likely to force Israel to do it? I don't think realistically we can think about this in the immediate future. Sadly, I don't, personally, my view is that I don't think this 100 or more years problem has an equitable resolution within the capitalist system. You may think that this is pessimistic, but I mean, I am a socialist. I think people in this seminar are socialists, and they are socialists because they believe that certain very fundamental problems of humanity cannot be solved within the framework of capitalism. For one example, a major one is the ecological problem, the deterioration of the environment. Can we expect a solution to this problem, a green capitalism? I don't think so. And one of the reasons I'm a socialist is because I don't think that problems like this, the major problems of humanity, can be solved within capitalism. I think the same, regrettably, applies to the national problem of the Palestinian problem, national problem of the Palestinian people. It's not because of general sort of ideological fixation that all national problems must wait till socialism to be resolved. I have no such overriding theory. I think the actual data of the particular given problem here is that there can be no force. The Israeli working class is capable of overthrowing the Zionist regime, but it has no incentive. What would it gain? It would, you see that the people who are talking about a one-state solution are talking about a capitalist one state. The Israeli working class would exchange its present position of being an exploited class in a dominant nation, privileged nation, for being part of a working class in a non-dominant nation. That's not a deal that is going to attract any major part of the Israeli Jewish working class. Of course, the Palestinian section, 20% of that class, would be glad to make this switch. Under a socialist Middle East, the situation could be that the Israeli working class could be invited to exchange its position of an exploited class in a dominant nation to be part of a ruling class, ruling working class in a non-dominant nation, in alliance of all the working classes of the region. That is a possible, I mean, at least in principle possible outcome. But I don't see, short of radical transformations in the region and in the world, that there is going to be a benign solution to this problem. I'm sorry to sound so pessimistic, but I think, you know, the same applies to climate and other major problems of the world.
It does. Thanks, Moshe. Next speaker is Carol, please.
Right. Hi. Hi, Moshe. That was really interesting. I think Steve beat me to the question. I read a very interesting article where written in a Jewish publication, where they were suggesting that Palestinians should be given equal rights in Israel, and and the people are starting to talk about that, and that is becoming a possibility. So as Steve was saying, that would be a democratic state where the Palestinians would have equal rights within Israel itself. And I guess you already answered that. You say that that's actually not going to happen. So that's quite sad, really. I thought that really was, that might be a possibility, a solution to the problem.
Can I come?
Sure, Moshe, come back, yeah.
I think you have slightly misunderstood me. I was not talking about an Israel with equal rights for the Palestinian minority within Israel. I was talking about one state in the whole of Palestine. in which the Israeli Jewish people, the Hebrew people, would become not a majority anymore, either numerically equal or even a minority. As the present situation is, the Israeli working class would not accept this. Getting greater equality to the Palestinian minority within Israel is a little bit more realistic. I don't think that the Zionist regime would concede real equality, but the situation as it is now is not as dire for these Palestinians as it is for the Palestinians of the West Bank, let alone the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip, let alone the refugees in camps and wherever. So these Palestinians within Israel at least enjoy civil rights to some extent. They are discriminated. I mean, don't have any illusions. But they do have the right to vote for the Knesset, and they have made increasingly good use of it. One of the most let us say impressive political leaders in Israel is a leader of the what is in effect the bloc of 4 Arab parties, and he himself is a leader of the Communist Party, which is part of this bloc. Is a Palestinian Arab. I think even his opponents agree that he is the most impressive, and he and his party have won certain margin of rights for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Situation is not there. I don't think anytime soon they are going to get full real equality. Discrimination is going to be, especially in view of the so-called nation-state law, which gives more rights in and over Israel to Jews living outside than to Palestinians living inside Israel. It's not just that they are discriminating against vis-a-vis their Israeli Jewish co-citizens. No, they are not supposed to have any national rights in the state of Israel, which is supposed to be the nation state, not only of its own Jewish population, but of the whole of Jewry all over the world, which is, according to Zionist mythology, a nation. It isn't, it's basically a religious denomination, but according to Zionist Jewry. So we have to separate. The situation vis-a-vis the Palestinian citizens of Israel is not as dire. It is bad, but it's not as dire as that of the occupied territories.
Thank you, Moshe. Next speaker is Keith Mallinson, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
All good, yes.
Yeah, fine. Given that in Cyprus, the United Nations were called in to monitor between the Greeks and the Turks, and also in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the UN was brought in, would that not be possible to do that with Israel-Palestine, or is that just a pipe dream of mine?
Should I address this?
Would you like to answer
Yes.
straight away? Go ahead.
I think this is not remotely on the cards. First of all, I mean, the United Nations was called upon in Cyprus once there was a basic arrangement imposed by the big powers. Both Greece and Turkey are members of NATO. They are in the same camp. Turkey was more, relatively major member of NATO. That was a totally different situation. Israel is not going to be coerced, as far as I can see, by the dominant powers in the region, which is, first of all, the United States and its camp followers. I mean, like Britain and so on. It is a major junior ally of imperialism in the region, first of all, but also beyond, because Israel fulfills a role in far beyond the Middle East on behalf and in the service of imperialism. There is a lot of material about it, but no, Israel is not going to be coerced. I mean, what this question implies is that somehow the United Nations is going to impose some kind of arrangement on Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I don't think there's any realistic prospect of this.
Thank you, Moshe. Next speaker, please, is Alan Cooper. Hello.
Hello, Moshe. I had a question. I thought the original Trump plan included a demand on the Arab states to accept the Palestinians really as no longer as refugees, but as citizens. And wouldn't that therefore lead to a situation where you didn't have Bantustans in Palestine? You had refugee camps, that they would turn all the Palestinians into refugees that were in Palestine and then eject them to become citizens of other countries. That's my question. Do you think that is a serious plan?
They may have dreams like this, but I think you have not formulated the idea correctly. The idea was that the Arab states would accept as their own citizens Palestinians that are already outside Palestine. There are millions of Palestinian refugees people who were expelled from Palestine in 1948-49. Their descendants, there are millions of these people who are, some of them integrated in various countries, including, Canada, Australia, all sorts of places, but many of them in camps around, in the Arab countries surrounding Israel. There's camps like this in Syria. In Lebanon, I mean, people may remember the Sabra and Shatila massacres of Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon. The only place where they got citizenship of the host country was in Jordan. There are many Palestinians who are now citizens of Jordan. So the Trump plan demands of the Arab countries like Syria or Lebanon and the Gulf states where there are Palestinian refugees to accept them as citizens of their country and to terminate their claim for repatriation to their original homeland. That is what it's about. So, I mean, this is what the Trump plan actually says. Israeli annexation of big tracts of the West Bank will lead to ethnic cleansing and will eventually create further waves of Palestinian refugees. But that is another question. This is not explicitly part of the Trump plan, but this is would be a historical consequence of implementing it.
Thank you, Moshe. Quick question from Chet in the chat. He respects your answer that there's no solution under a capitalist system. And the question becomes, can we deliver worldwide socialism and ecological responsibility before extinction? So that's a bit of a question there, but I'm bringing in, do you want to?
No, I don't want to, I don't have any special sort of knowledge or competence on this. I mean, this should be a topic for another meeting. I mean, I think socialism could solve this problem. Whether it will be brought about soon enough is a major question. I don't know. I don't have the answer to this.
Indeed. Thank you. Next speaker from the floor is Henry, please.
Hi, Moshe. Nice to see you. You spoke briefly about demands that we can raise, should raise. You talked about withdrawing the Israeli forces from the occupied West Bank. Talk about demanding recognizing the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. You alluded earlier to maybe the demand for de-Zionization of Israel. So you must have noticed that there was a big demonstration in Tel Aviv a few days ago, mostly of middle-class Israelis who were protesting the government's economic policies with regard to the COVID crisis. So my question to you, and the Jabha, the Hadash, the political coalition led by Iman Auda, who you praised earlier, participated in that demonstration with what I thought were pretty incoherent political demands. My question for you is quite simple. Should socialists in Israel have participated in that demonstration? And if so, with what political message should we be participating in such political demonstrations in Israel?
Well, I don't think it was merely a middle class demonstration. Protesting against the economic hardship and also against the way that the government is now seen to mishandle the virus, the corona crisis. Israel initially was doing quite well in this situation, but now the position has been changed very, very adversely. So yes, I think would take part in such demonstration and raise their own demands. This is, demands that are demands of the working class. This was about economic hardship. Workers have something special to say about this in Israel as anywhere else. I mean, the degree of privatization and inequality in Israel is even worse than in this country. Health workers and care workers are suffering to even greater extent. So yes, I mean, the socialists should join this kind of demonstration. There was nothing anti-socialist about it. I mean, the demands were not inimical to socialism, but socialists should take part in any similar demonstration with their own specific demands.
Sorry, so next is Alan, please.
Hi, Moshe. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting points that you put over. I'd like to look at it as to what you feel socialists in this country and socialists around the world should be doing, what the Labour Party's policy should be on annexation, and what action should be taken, i.e. things like, do boycotts of Israeli goods do any good? Is it something that should be actively followed? And are there any other actions that should be taken by people in this country and also governments around the world as far as the annexation policy?
Well, let me preface the answer to this question by making a general point. Jews across the world are minorities that ought to be protected, that are, they are not in such bad situation as they used to be. I mean, in living memory. I mean, in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, but they are vulnerable, and they feel even more vulnerable because of the memories of the distant past. They do require and deserve protection as minorities, and attitudes of progressive people and socialists that take this into consideration. Israel, on the other hand, is a state, is a predator, is a colonizer, is an annexer, is an aggressor, is a major, the major regional power. It is trying to, as it were, make use of the just demands of Jews all over the world to be protected in order to defend itself, to, as it were, annex this prerogative of being a persecuted minority. Israel, a colonizer, atomic, nuclear, regional power, is trying to make use of the rights of the valid rights of the Jewish minorities worldwide to be defended against discrimination and so on. This is the situation as we face now. So any attempt to bring Israel to the court of public opinion, and any major step to try to restrain its annexationism and so on is met with accusations of anti-Semitism. This is the situation as it is. This is what applies in particular to the BDS campaign. The BDS campaign is a non-violent civic movement to express solidarity with Palestinian rights and to bring Israel to account. I think what is the alternative? The alternative is do nothing or support violent action. I mean, I don't think violent actions of the Palestinians have brought them any results, and the situation does not. I mean, Israel is not Algeria. It is not Vietnam. I think the attempt, and it's not South Lebanon, where a guerrilla movement against Israel was successful. Whatever you think about the people who actually mounted this guerrilla war, but Israel-Palestine is not a suitable arena for armed insurrection. World public opinion can help with support for such non-violent means as the BDS movement. But beyond this, I think the virtue of this is not so much that it's going to destabilize Israel. I think, you know, anyone who thinks that the BDS, the boycott of Israeli products or some disinvestment is going to make the Israeli economy collapse, I think is engaging in pipe dreams. But it has the virtue of raising the issue in public opinion wherever, you know, you have a branch of a trade union or a student organization, and people raise this issue of BDS, it raises also the consciousness of people, because the problem of the Palestinian people is being discussed. And this is why Israel and the organizations everywhere who are devoted to Israel advocacy are so hostile to it. Israel is a special ministry set up specifically to fight the BDS movement abroad, which is ridiculous. I mean, this is a movement of, you know, without any great political power, without any great resources. It is mainly has got moral power. But Israel has got a whole ministry that is engaged in dark operations outside Israel to destabilize it, to undermine people active in it, and to accuse them of all sorts of horrible things. But beyond this, I think public opinion should be mobilized for a more specific aim, because annexation is Zionist style, as I explained, is coupled with the consequence, with the corollary of ethnic cleansing. This was not the case in South African apartheid. As I pointed out before, the settlers in South Africa, quasi-class really, needed the indigenous people as workers. The whole economy depended on it. Israel, the style of colonization that Zionism has taken is more similar to what took place in Australia, in North America, in the northern part of the United States, not where the economy depended on slaves, but where the idea was, you know, as settlers who are doing the work themselves, and the so-called Indians, the indigenous people of America, were surplus to requirement. Similarly, in Australia, a similar pattern, of course, with many specific differences, is in Israel-Palestine. So Israeli annexation has a corollary of ethnic cleansing, as you can see from the Golan Heights. Israel annexed, actually, I mean, people tend to forget that Israel has annexed, you know, big swath of land in Syria, just across the border from mandatory Palestine. But there it took care to get rid of most of the indigenous population, leaving aside only the Druze minority for reasons that I don't want to go into. So I think we have to prepare public opinion to mobilize against the prospect of ethnic cleansing.
Thank you, Moshe. Okay, the next comrade to ask a question or make a comment is David, please.
Hi, good evening, and thanks, Moshe. That was a really interesting talk, and I think I learned a lot from it, so thanks for that. My question is really the issue of the, I say, sustainability of the area which Israel occupies, and as much there is a considerable lack of rainfall in the area that's been there for many hundreds of years, and therefore water is not, so to say, coming down from the Jordan as it used to in previous times, so therefore having a Western civilization in essential area which is rapidly becoming desert is going to be a problem for anyone who lives there, and therefore sort of what the whole civilization there is relying on is water that was from rainfall sort of many centuries before, and this has been drilled out by wells. So once this is exhausted, then there's nothing left. So I wonder if you would comment about that.
Yes, well, there are several points. First of all, this problem is not unique to Israel by any means.
Absolutely.
It is a problem. I mean, you refer to the River Jordan. I don't know if you've been there recently. People imagine, you know, especially in people who have heard, you know, the lovely Negro spirituals about the River Jordan, that it is a mighty river. If you go there and have a look at it, it's barely a dry stream. I mean, it's a puddle, very little water in it. This current year, there has been more waterfall actually than normal, so that the Jordan is flowing a little bit. The Lake of Galilee has almost regained its normal level, but actually it was, which is sort of in the upper part of the Jordan. The Dead Sea, which is where the Jordan flows into, is partly lost a lot of its area. It's partly dried up. But another point is that Israel is actually one of the world's leaders in water desalination. it's got both sun and salt water of the Mediterranean, which it is now, I mean, the process of desalination used to be very expensive, not really economically viable. In more recent years, it has become not too expensive. And in fact, this process of desalination is practiced not only in Israel, but also in some of the Gulf areas where they have bought parts of this Israeli technology, or maybe also technology from other parts. So in the short and medium term, there is no pressing problem for Israel of water. There is a big problem for the Palestinians in the occupied territories because Israel is stealing their underground water and is not allowing them to use. I mean, in Gaza, the situation is catastrophic. There is really no water, no drinkable water in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is dying of thirst, really. In the West Bank, there is a great shortage of, whereas Israeli settlers have swimming pools and so on, the Palestinian peasants, farmers in the West Bank are not allowed to drill wells. Israel is actually taking the aquifer from the West Bank. But for Israel itself, the water situation is not dire at the moment. So, but in the longer term, if there is serious warming, I mean, the temperature is going to be much higher and that will create problem, but not only for Israel, it will create a problem for the whole region.
Thank you, Moshe. Before I bring in Edward, there was a question in the chat, which you could answer maybe when you answer the next question as well, is your view on the One Democratic State campaign and similar campaigns. So Edward's question, please, or comment. So there you are.
Myself first, right. I've been so absolutely fascinated by what Moshe has been saying that I've almost forgotten what I wanted to say and ask him, but I've now kind of half remembered it. And what it was, I was thinking was, in the case of South Africa, sanctions there were, people said it was a national cause, but it wasn't. Sanctions bloody worked in South Africa. So I believe that sanctions would work if applied to Israel. I am a firm believer in BDS. I never saw pictures of South Africa bombing the hell out of African townships. So what do you, Moshe, think about the fact that can sanctions on Israel in the form of BDS, not just on the goods coming out of the West Bank, but on Israel as a whole, from its bloody crimes against humanity, really, can they work?
I will start with this question and go on to the one state idea, because they are connected actually. The model of the one state idea is post-apartheid South Africa. Well, no, I don't think that, first of all, I don't think it's true to say that it was international sanctions that were the major factor in ending the apartheid regime in South Africa. Let me explain. They were certainly helpful. They created the good international atmosphere, but I think the crucial factors that led to the downfall of the apartheid regime were twofold. First of all, the class struggle inside South Africa. The vast majority of the population of South Africa were the oppressed people who were indispensable for the colonizers, for the settlers, for the so-called whites, but who increasingly were unable to cope with them. I mean, the question of sustainability of the old apartheid regime was very serious for the ruling minority. Secondly, there was a defeat, military defeat of South Africa in Namibia and in Angola, especially in Angola. There was apartheid South Africa suffered serious military defeat in Angola and in Namibia, what became Namibia. So it was a combination of these. Certainly the sanctions played a role, but I think people are exaggerating and are engaging in fantasies if they think that sanctions alone can overthrow this. Look what sanctions are doing to Iran. Is it overthrowing the Iranian regime? No, it's actually reinforcing it and making its population even more supportive of the regime. But that is in a situation where there are plenty of major international forces that would like to and have any interest in applying sanctions to Iran. But who is going to do the same to Israel? The United States? Don't make me laugh. Israel is a favorite ally. If there is really a special relationship, it's not between the United States and the British government, it is between the United States and Israel. It's a favorite ally for good reasons. It's a major strategic asset. So this is not going to happen. Sanctions and so on can be imposed by civil society, but they are, as I said, they are not going anywhere near to really cause the undermining of the Israeli Zionist regime. Now I want to come to the other question. What do I think of the single democratic state? Well, there are two versions of it. One is impossible in the existing situation, in the foreseeable future. I mean, I'm talking under a capitalist world system. And the other one is even more impossible. The one that is impossible, but is in itself nice. I mean, it's something that I wish could happen. You know, I'm not sort of so happy about the idea that I'm convinced of, that the real solution to the Palestinian problem is possible only under socialism. I wish it were otherwise. One state in which there is equal rights both to all individuals and to as well as to the two national groups, that is to say, some kind of binational arrangement, a state in which there is equal rights to people individually and to the two national groups as collectives. This is not any moral idea. I don't criticize people. I mean, people who advocate the two-state solution are either naive or malign. They have the wrong motives. I think this is something that should be exposed. I don't have the same attitude to this idea of one state with equal rights to all. I wish it were possible. I just don't think that there are the social forces that are able to bring it about. The other version of the one state idea is one state with no national rights to anyone. I mean, it's like a rainbow situation where there is, as it were, one society without recognizing any national rights. I think this is a bad idea for various reasons, because, as you know, the situation there is quite different from South Africa. There are two distinct national groups, Palestinian Arabs and Hebrew-speaking Israeli Jews, both of more or less equal number, and without recognizing this fact, any idea of a one state is a non-starter, especially since the two groups do not actually belong to the same super nation. I mean, the Palestinian Arabs are part of the surrounding all Arab nation, the pan-Arab national entity. Israeli Jews are not part of it. They are a distinct group. They have their own language. So to ignore the fact that there are two national groups there that should be given their own national rights makes the idea even more impossible, because of course, I mean, what kind of society would that be if you impose on the Israeli Jews a loss of their national identity? I mean, this is I mean, they're going to oppose even the good, the nice version of the one-state solution, but who is going to force them to give up their national identity? I think this is not a very good idea. So I have no criticism on the moral basis of the one-state idea that recognizes the existence of two national groups. By the way, I recommend a wonderful recent book that has been published a few months ago by Rashid Khalidi, The 100 Years War Against Palestine. 100 Years War on Palestine, so words to this effect. And he is a Palestinian scholar who actually recognizes the fact that I have said, and is in favor of the idea of a solution that would recognize not only equal rights of everyone, but of the two distinct, discrete national groups that exist in Israel-Palestine.
Thank you very much, Moshe. That was a very good explanation on the one-state proposals. Steve Freeman would like to ask another question or make a comment. You're muted. Oh, sorry, Steve. I think I muted you again. Sorry. We both pressed it at the same time. I think you have to do it at your end. Sorry. Can you try again?
Try again.
There you go. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Great, thank
all
you.
Good.
Okay, Moshe, so I think there's two democratic questions here. One is a question about the struggle for democracy within Israel. All right, if we don't see Israel as a really democratic state because it's a Zionist state, then there must be a motive force for democracy in Israel, which is a form of the class struggle, of course, because it's the working class has got an interest in democratizing Israel. On the other hand, you've got this other democratic question relating to Israel's occupation Israel's control of the occupied territories. Now, these two separate questions about democracy seem to me are connected together, and the program for that area has got to connect both of them up together. Democratic Israel is not possible without a democratic solution to the problem of the occupation of Palestine. So a phrase that I've not heard before, but it's one that came up in this meeting, de-Zionization, I think somebody called it. Is it possible to have a democratic Israel which would require it to recognize, to withdraw from the occupied territories, which was a democratic and secular republic and not a Zionist republic? In other words, there's de-Zionization. Is it not possible? Do you think there are no forces within Israel? Because those demonstrations you mentioned and the Arab population, etc., within Israel, surely that's where the force of democracy within Israel has to come about. Do you think that the Israeli working class is so Zionized, as it were, that it can never see its interests lie in democracy, not in Zionism? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Moshe, Steve was the last person who wanted to indicate, so if you can use this last answer to wrap up as well, that would be great.
Okay. Well, somebody said that a nation that oppresses another cannot itself be free. And I think this is this aphorism is totally vindicated in the reality of Israel. Somehow, you see, although there is, as everywhere, in every other capitalist country, there is a class struggle, and the workers sometimes mobilize and fight their own corner, you know, in this. You've seen the demonstrations recently. Somebody said there were 100,000 people in Tel Aviv, but another journalist who was actually there says, no, I'm experienced in counting them, there were 200,000 people. It's enormous. Sorry, 20,000 people. Let's not exaggerate. This is huge in comparison to Israel, especially under present conditions. Because of the virus thing, they were mostly young people, because older people didn't dare go out, I mean, for the most part. There is a class struggle. I mean, and the class struggle continues, but somehow in Israel, there is a very rapid process of what some people call fascization. I wouldn't call it fascism, because as a Marxist, I have a more precise definition of what fascism is, but you see what I mean. Israel is going very fast in the same direction as India under Modi, as Brazil under Bolsonaro, as Turkey under Erdogan, as you can say the United States under Trump, and Hungary under Orban. Israel belongs to the same club. The process of, let us say, attack on the judicial system, on the various attributes of democracy in Israel, I mean, is astounding. People, I mean, you don't read about it in the British press. There's hardly a mention. But I mean, Israel is being now governed by a government headed by someone who is a criminal defendant. He is a suspected criminal of bribery and corruption. He is managing to distort the whole political process in order to serve just his own interests to stay out of jail. And in doing this, he empties the various institutions of so-called bourgeois democracy, the judiciary and the legislature, the Knesset itself, of their powers, is sucking away powers and converting Israel into what I think Orban in Hungary has called an illiberal democracy. You can see what this means. But in Israel, the conflict between Israel as a settler state, as a colonizer, with its colonized people, the Palestinians, is actually contributing to this process of vacating or sucking the contents out of bourgeois democracy. It is a very rapid process. As I said, I mean, people who read my circulars on my mailing list may have some idea of it, because Haaretz, the Israeli liberal newspaper, keeps reporting on it and condemning it. But world public opinion is mostly ignorant of what is taking place. So the situation is dire. Let me give you something which is both pessimistic and optimistic. In 2011, you remember the wave of demonstrations worldwide, sittings in the West, and in Egypt, the failed Egyptian revolution, the Arab Spring. Well, this was the occasion also of the biggest demonstrations in Israeli history, of people demanding their rights economic and social rights, protesting against privatization. One of the slogans was in these demonstrations, the market is free, but we are slaves. I think it's a wonderful slogan against privatization. The market is free, but we are its slaves. Among other things, the demonstrators agreed not to discuss the occupation of Palestinian territories. It was a taboo issue that was considered too divisive. So that actually, as it were, weakened the contents of the protest. But on the other hand, there was an amazing amount of solidarity with the protests, with the demonstrations of the workers in Egypt and at that time also in Syria until it was squashed. There was evident expressions of solidarity of the Israeli masses with the Egyptian working class, with the Egyptian people, with the Syrian people. I think this is, an indication that perhaps the road to the liberation of Palestine could be traced by an alliance of the Israeli working class with the Egyptian and other Arab working classes in the surrounding region. This is a bit of optimism, but I think it is, while I'm preaching pessimism of the intellect, this is optimism of the will.
Very good, Moshe. I think quite timely as well at the end. A bit of a glimpse of a solution, not a huge chance, but more chance than via the one state or two state proposals, I think so. Thank you very much, Moshe. I really enjoyed it. And thanks everybody and have a good evening. See you for our next session. Bye-bye.